Welcome to Thread of Terror. We bring you the creepiest stories from Reddit. Dim the lights, grab a blanket, and hit subscribe so you never miss a scare. What is something scary that has happened to you that you cannot explain rationally? Story 1. Locked doors, unlocked fear.
I live in a condominium where my family owns 2 apartments, one on the 7th floor and the other on the 8th. The only way to move between the 2 is to step out of one apartment, take the elevator or staircase, and enter the other. They are not stacked directly on top of each other and are entirely separate spaces. One night during dinner, my mom asked me to go downstairs to the 7th floor apartment to grab some ice cream from the freezer. Armed with the keys, I made my way down. Since everyone was upstairs eating, the 7th floor apartment was supposed to be empty. I unlocked all 3 layers of security, the gate with 2 locks and the door itself, and walked into the pitch dark apartment. As I turned on the light, I froze. Someone was sitting silently on the sofa. It was my dad, or so it seemed. Seeing him there startled me, but I thought maybe he had come down for something and had locked the door behind him. Still, it was odd that he was just sitting there without saying anything. I quickly grabbed the ice cream and casually asked if he had the keys to lock up the apartment. He did not respond. Feeling slightly unnerved, but reasoning that he must have a set of keys if he was there, I shrugged it off and headed back upstairs. When I returned to the 8th floor, I was stunned. My dad was already there, sitting at the dining table and eating dinner with the rest of my family. I froze in my tracks. I asked him how he managed to get upstairs so quickly, but he looked confused and told me he had been there the entire time. My mom and everyone else confirmed it. He had not left the 8th floor at all that evening. Panic began to creep in as I told them about the figure I had just seen downstairs. I described how it looked exactly like him, down to his build, face, and the serious expression he always has. No one believed me, dismissing it as a trick of the light or my imagination. But I was certain of what I saw. That was not a mistake. It was my dad, or something that looked exactly like him. What made this even more terrifying was the impossibility of it all. The apartments are not connected in any way. To move between them, you have to go into the common hallway and take the elevator or stairs. There is no way for someone to go up or down without being seen. Furthermore, the 7th floor apartment was securely locked when I arrived, and I had used the keys to open it. For my dad to have been there meant someone or something had unlocked and entered the apartment without explanation. Now I avoid going to the 7th floor alone, especially at night. The experience left me deeply unsettled, and the memory of seeing my dad sitting silently on the sofa haunts me to this day.
Story 2. Alone in the woods.
I used to work as a maintenance worker at historic properties, which often meant spending time in eerie, centuries-old buildings steeped in history. One of these properties was a historic house museum situated within a larger landmark site. The site included a visitor centre with offices, and about half a mile away, up a dirt road surrounded by dense was the house itself. The house was filled with artifacts and stories from the past, and while it attracted visitors during open hours, I often found myself there alone during maintenance shifts. The isolation of the house, combined with its history, gave it an unsettling atmosphere, especially in the colder months when the days were short and the woods seemed darker and more foreboding. One overcast winter day, I was working alone, preparing to conduct electrical repairs on the exterior of the house. The weather was gloomy, with heavy cloud cover making it feel much later in the day than it actually was. Before beginning my work, I went inside the house to turn off the electricity. I located the main circuit breaker and shut off the power to the entire property. To ensure safety, I tested the circuits several times. They were all off. Confident that there was no active power in the house, I locked all the doors and headed outside to begin my work. For about an hour, I focused on my task, climbing up and down the ladder to examine and prepare the exterior for repairs. The silence around me was profound, interrupted only by the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. As I stepped down from the ladder to inspect the area, something unusual caught my eye. One of the lights inside the house was glowing. I froze in disbelief. My mind raced to find a logical explanation. I had personally shut off the power, and the house was supposed to be empty. Initially, I thought perhaps a co-worker was playing a prank, or that someone else had somehow entered the house. Hoping to resolve the mystery, I used my walkie-talkie to contact the visitor center. The person on the other end confirmed that no one had left the office that day, and all the keys to the house were accounted for. Hearing this sent a chill through me. With my heart pounding, I decided I could not remain there alone. I hastily packed up my tools and made the half-mile journey back through the wooded road to the visitor center. My co-worker noticed my unease and agreed to accompany me back to investigate. When we arrived, the light that had been glowing just moments before was now off. Cautiously, we entered the house and checked every room to ensure no one had entered. To our astonishment, all the doors remained locked, just as I had left them. However, when we touched the light bulb that had been illuminated, it was still warm to the touch. This discovery defied explanation. The electricity to the house was entirely shut off, so the light should not have been able to turn on. Even now, the memory of that incident sends shivers down my spine. It was an encounter that left me questioning the boundaries between the physical and the unexplained. The historic house, with its silent, shadowy halls, remains etched in my mind as a place where echoes of the past might linger far beyond what we can understand.
Story 3. What was on my bed that night?
When I was 6 years old, I had a cat named Buster. Buster originally belonged to my stepdad, but as a child who had never had a pet before, I immediately claimed him as my own. Unfortunately, Buster did not share my enthusiasm. He disliked being hugged and coddled, often avoiding me whenever he could. As an outdoor cat, he spent most of his days outside, only coming inside at night to eat and sleep. One night, Buster did not return home. It was unusual, and I grew anxious, especially since our neighborhood was known to have coyotes roaming around. My parents seemed strangely quiet about his absence, dismissing my concerns and avoiding the topic altogether. That night, as I lay in bed trying to fall asleep, I heard a soft thud. Turning my head, I saw Buster jump onto my bed. For the first time ever, he lay down beside my head and allowed me to pet him. I was stunned but overjoyed. I whispered to him how much I loved him, feeling his soft fur and hearing his gentle purrs. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep, comforted by his unexpected presence. The next morning, I rushed downstairs, excited to tell my parents that Buster had finally warmed up to me and spent the night on my bed. When I shared this, their faces went pale. They exchanged a worried glance before sitting me down at the table to tell me the truth. The previous night, shortly before I went to bed, they had found Buster's lifeless body in the alley behind our house. He had been attacked by a coyote, and the injuries were unmistakable. He had been dead for hours. A chill ran down my spine. If Buster had died the previous evening, what or who had been on my bed? My parents tried to reassure me, insisting it must have been a dream or my imagination, but I knew better. I had felt his weight on the mattress, his fur beneath my hand, and the vibrations of his purr. To this day, I do not know if it was truly Buster's spirit coming to say goodbye, or if it was something else entirely. What I do know is that, after that night, my room always felt colder, and I could never shake the feeling that I was not alone.
Story 4. Abandoned car.
It had only been a month since my parents got married, and they were still adjusting to their new life together. It was a quiet night, the kind where everything felt peaceful, with only the faint sounds of the house settling creaks from the floorboards, the soft hum of the refrigerator. My parents were fast asleep, tucked under the covers, when suddenly my mum jolted upright in bed, her eyes wide with fear. She gasped loudly and started shaking my dad awake. "Jimmy, Jimmy," she cried, her voice filled with panic. "There's blood everywhere. We have to help them. Please." Still half asleep, my dad struggled to shake off the drowsiness and comfort her. "Honey, what are you talking about? What blood? What's going on?" In between shallow breaths, my mom explained that she had seen a car with German license plates on the side of the road in a terrible accident. People were bleeding, and they needed help. My dad, still groggy from being woken abruptly, tried to calm her down, assuring her that it was just a bad dream. He told her everything would be fine, and that she had nothing to worry about. But my mum wasn't convinced. She insisted, almost pleadingly, that they drive to the exact location she had seen in her dream. She was certain something terrible had happened, and she couldn't ignore it. My dad, trying to calm her, agreed to go along with it, thinking that a quick drive would settle her nerves and help them get back to sleep. So they dressed quickly and headed out. The night was cool and quiet, with only the occasional car passing on the distant highway. My dad drove, but his mind raced as he tried to figure out what was going on. He didn't believe in dreams being predictive, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. He brushed it off, though, assuming it was just his wife's overactive imagination after a frightening dream. As they drove, my mum directed him with precision. She knew exactly where to go, her instructions clear and detailed. Finally, they reached a desolate stretch of road, the kind of place that felt eerily empty at night. And there it was, just as my mum had described. A car parked on the side of the road, its emergency flashes blinking in the darkness. My dad's heart skipped a beat. The car looked exactly as my mum had said it would. It had German license plates. Without hesitation, my dad parked the car beside it and got out, cautiously approaching the vehicle. My mom, now visibly shaken, followed him, her face pale with worry. But when they reached the car, something strange happened. It was completely empty. There was no one inside. The vehicle's flashers continued blinking, but there was no sign of anyone around. No sign of a crash, no blood, nothing at all. My dad walked around the car, peering inside, but there was nothing, no occupants, no injuries, no wreckage. Confused, he turned to my mum. "Are you sure this is the right spot?" he asked quietly, his voice filled with disbelief. My mum nodded, wide-eyed, her fear now mixed with a sense of bewilderment. "Yes, this is it. I saw them. I saw the accident." A chill ran down my dad's spine. He didn't know what to make of it. The car was exactly as described, but everything else was wrong. There was no sign of an accident or anyone needing help. No blood, no wreckage, nothing that explained my mum's vision. They checked the area once more, but everything was calm, almost too calm. It was as if the scene had been frozen in time. The car's lights flickered in the dark, and the night was still, silent, and unsettling. It felt like they had stepped into a strange, surreal dream. After a few tense moments, they got back into their car and started driving away. My dad still couldn't shake the eerie feeling in his chest. He didn't know what to believe. How could my mum's dream match the reality so perfectly? Why was the car left there, abandoned, with no one in it? It was as if everything had already been taken care of before they even arrived. To this day, my parents talk about night in hushed tones. Neither of them can explain what happened. My mum is certain she saw the accident in a vision. A warning maybe, and she believes they helped simply by showing up. My dad, on the other hand, remains baffled. He can't fathom how a dream could manifest so vividly in reality. Every time they pass that stretch of road, they glance nervously toward the spot, half expecting to see something or someone that shouldn't be there. That night still lingers in their minds, unanswered and unsettling. And it's a story they've only told a few people until now. What really happened that night? Was it some kind of supernatural warning? A bizarre coincidence? Or was there something else at play, something beyond understanding? Sometimes life presents us with experiences so strange, so impossible to comprehend, that all we can do is wonder if there's more to this world than we can see.
Story 5. A Ghostly Welcome.
It was a quiet, exciting time for my parents, as they had just welcomed their first child, my older sister Kathy. My dad was stationed in Italy with the United States Air Force, and they had spent a year living there before bringing Kathy back to the United States to introduce her to my dad's side of the family. It was a long flight, and they were both exhausted, especially my mom, who was still recovering from the jet lag. They arrived at my dad's parents' house, a cozy little home in a quiet suburban town. It was their first night there, and everything was new for my mom. She had never been to this house before, and with Kathy being so young, she was still adjusting to being a new mother. That night, my dad went out to spend some time with his brothers, leaving my mom alone with Kathy in the front bedroom. My mom had just managed to drift off to sleep, lulled by the soft sounds of the house settling, when she was suddenly awoken by a strange sensation. At first, she thought it was a dream, but when her eyes opened, she was shocked to find a woman standing at the foot of her bed. The room was dim, with just a sliver of moonlight streaming through the window. The woman had long white hair that flowed down to her waist and was wearing a simple blue dress. She seemed peaceful, almost serene. Without any introduction, the woman walked toward the bed and sat down beside my mom, gently patting her hand. "Shh, it's okay. I just wanted to welcome you to the family," she said softly, her voice calming but distant. My mom, confused and startled, instinctively recoiled but tried not to show it, thinking perhaps it was a distant relative or a family friend who had arrived late. She had never met anyone in the family who looked like this woman, but maybe she just didn't recognize her. The woman didn't seem threatening, just oddly comforting in a way. The woman got up from the bed and walked over to the bassinet where my baby sister was sleeping soundly. She gazed at Kathy with a smile. "Is this your daughter?" she asked. "Yes," my mom replied, her voice trembling slightly, not sure if she should be frightened or not. "She's beautiful," the woman exclaimed, her eyes lighting up with joy. "It's lovely to meet you both." With that, the woman stood up and quietly left the room, disappearing down the hallway. My mom, still in a state of confusion, was left wide awake, trying to piece together what had just happened. She had never heard any footsteps, nor had she noticed any noise when the woman entered. It was as if she had just appeared out of nowhere. But my mum was too tired to fully process it and eventually fell back to sleep, though uneasily. The next morning, my mum was sitting at the kitchen table having breakfast with my grandmother, my dad's mother. She was still shaken by the strange encounter, but she didn't know how to explain it. She casually brought it up, hoping it was just a figment of her jet-lagged mind. "Who was the woman that came over last night?" my mum asked. "She just walked right into my room and talked to me." My grandmother stopped what she was doing and stared at my mum, a confused look crossing her face. "What woman?" she asked, genuinely puzzled. "She was tall," my mum explained, with long white hair and a blue dress. "She came into my room, sat on the bed, and said she wanted to welcome me to the family. Then she went over to the bassinet and looked at Kathy. She said Kathy was beautiful, and then she left." My grandmother's face went pale, her expression changing drastically. My mom, noticing the sudden shift, felt a deep sense of unease. My grandmother remained silent for a few long seconds before standing up quickly, almost as if she had been startled. "Wait here," my grandmother said in a voice that was more urgent than before. She hurried out of the room, her footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. A few minutes later, she returned, holding an old photo album in her hands. She opened the album, flipping through the pages, her hands trembling slightly. "Is this her?" my grandmother asked, pulling out a photograph and showing it to my mom. The woman in the picture had long white hair and was dressed in a blue dress, just like my mom had described. My mom, though still confused, nodded. "Yes, that's the woman I saw last night." My grandmother's face drained of all color, her eyes wide with shock. "That's my mother," she whispered, barely able to speak. "She died 20 years ago. We buried her in a blue dress." The room went deathly silent. My mom felt a chill run down her spine. My grandmother's words hung in the air, almost too heavy to comprehend. The woman my mom had seen, the one who had welcomed her into the family, was my grandmother's mother, who had been dead for 2 decades. There was no logical explanation for it. The woman had been gone for years, and yet She had appeared to my mom in such vivid detail. The realization hit my mom like a ton of brick. She couldn't explain what had happened or why it had happened, but there was no denying it. Some force, something beyond the ordinary, had brought that woman to her that night. For the rest of the visit, my mom couldn't shake the eerie feeling that someone or something was watching her, making sure she was part of the family. My grandmother was deeply unsettled by the event, but she never spoke of it again. To this day, my mom and grandmother talk about that night in hushed tones, never fully understanding what happened. My mom insists that it was a comforting presence, a kind of welcome from the beyond. But my grandmother never truly recovered from the shock. She still keeps the photo of her mother in a place of reverence, but now with a strange sense of caution. Sometimes when my parents or relatives talk about family, they'll glance at the old family photo albums, and my mum will pause on that picture. A shiver will run down her spine, and she'll quietly wonder if her encounter that night was a warning, a blessing, or something else entirely. And though no one in the family has ever truly explained it, every now and then, my mom will catch a glimpse of something, a shadow, a fleeting presence. When she's alone, and she can't help but feel that the woman in the blue dress is still with her.
Story 6. A creepy message.
I was working the graveyard shift at a hotel in Albuquerque, exhausted but pushing through the night. The hotel was quiet, the only sound being the occasional chatter between me and the security guard, who was also wrapping up his shift. As the night dragged on, he asked if I could give him a ride home. Instead of waiting for another 30 minutes for my shift to end, I decided to leave early. I scribbled a quick note for my boss, telling her that I had to leave because my brother was stranded outside of town and needed me to pick him up. It was a lie, but I needed an excuse to leave. I dropped the security guard off at his house and finally made my way home. I went straight to bed, completely drained from the night shift. After only a few hours of sleep, I was jolted awake by my phone ringing. It was my brother. "Hey, I'm stuck outside of town," he said, his voice sounding a little more frantic than usual. "Can you come pick me up?" I froze for a moment. My brother was calling me, just as I had told my boss earlier in the night. I half joked, what a coincidence. I told my boss the same thing. He didn't seem fazed by my comment. "That's not what's weird," he said cryptically. "I'll show you when you get here." Curiosity piqued, I rushed out of the house and drove to meet him. When I finally arrived, he met me in the parking lot, his face looking serious but oddly calm. I asked him what was so weird, and he pulled out his phone, holding it up to my ear. "Listen to this," he said. He played a message that had been left for him that morning. The voice sounded faint and almost computerized, its tone eerie and cold. It said, "You're stuck." The words echoed in my head, the chill creeping down my spine. I pulled the phone away, staring at my brother, who seemed equally unsettled. Neither of us knew where the call had come from or why it was sent to him. It was as if someone or something knew exactly where he was and what had happened. The timing was too perfect, and the message too cryptic to dismiss as a coincidence. Freaked us both out, my brother said quietly, "I've never heard anything like that before." I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something beyond explanation. We never figured out where the call had come from or what it meant. It remains the strangest and creepiest thing that's ever happened to either of us. Every time I think about it, I still get the chills. Something or someone was watching.
Story 7. Stuck between two realities.
It was an ordinary day in first grade and recess had finally come. The sun hung high in the sky, casting a warm glow over the schoolyard as the sounds of children playing echoed in the background. My best friend was busy shooting hoops on the basketball court, trying to make impressive shots from halfway across the court. I, on the other hand, was sitting on the pavement, engrossed in my Nintendo DS, playing one of my favorite games. It was a small, quiet escape from the hustle of the playground. As I focused on the screen, I heard my friend call out to me, asking if I thought he could make a shot from the far end of the court. Without even glancing up, I replied, "You can try, but I don't think you'll make it." I was half absorbed in the game, my fingers tapping away at the controls as I advanced through the level. But then, something strange happened. Out of nowhere, I heard a voice. It wasn't my friend's voice, but the unmistakable tone of my dad's. "What do you mean?" he asked, sounding curious, almost confused. I blinked, disoriented, and slowly pulled my eyes away from the screen. As I lifted my head, the world around me shifted, and I suddenly found myself no longer on the schoolyard. I was sitting on the carpet in my living room at home, the game still in my hands, the same position as before, legs crossed, body slouched, completely still. The daylight outside had vanished, replaced by the dim glow of streetlights filtering through the curtains. It was dark now, and the clock on the wall told me that hours had passed. My heart raced as I looked around, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I was frozen in place, confused. My dad was sitting across from me, in the same chair he always sat in when he was home, looking at me with an expression that seemed a little too calm. He was watching me, waiting for me to explain. But I didn't know what to say. "What do you mean by that?" my dad asked again, his voice a little more insistent this time, but there was a strange quality to it that made my skin crawl. It was as though he hadn't just walked in. It felt like he'd been there the whole time, like he'd always been there. I glanced around the room, trying to ground myself. Everything looked normal, just like it always had. The same furniture, the same TV, the same bookshelf with my childhood books. But something wasn't right. How had I gotten here? Just a moment ago, I had been outside at school. I hadn't seen my dad come in. I hadn't seen the sunset. It was as though time itself had taken a sharp turn, and I had somehow missed the shift. For a moment, I considered that maybe I had fallen asleep. Perhaps I'd blacked out or dozed off on the pavement. But that didn't explain how I was still holding the same position in the game, the same screen in front of me. It felt too real, too vivid to be a dream. I couldn't remember ever feeling this disoriented, especially not in my own house. Later that night, after everything seemed to return to normal, I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The memory of that moment lingered, tugging at my mind. It was as though time had somehow fractured, and I had experienced a moment that didn't belong. A strange sensation gnawed at me, making my skin crawl. It didn't feel like a dream. It felt like I had been somewhere else, somewhere I wasn't supposed to be, and then pulled back. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just a strange, inexplicable moment. But the more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. Had I somehow slipped into another reality, or was there something I had missed in my memory? It didn't make sense, and no matter how many times I tried to brush it off, the feeling stayed with me. The next day at school, everything seemed normal again, but as I sat there with my friend at recess, I couldn't help but remember the bizarre shift in time. And I couldn't shake the feeling that the world around me wasn't as solid as I thought it was. There were moments, even now, when I wonder if that day was just a glitch in reality, or if something else happened, something beyond my understanding. The strangest part, I've never been able to forget it. It still haunts me, like a memory that doesn't belong, an event that doesn't fit into the normal flow of my life. Something happened that day, something I may never fully understand.
Story 8. Shadow Man.
I am fairly certain that I lived in a haunted house for a while. A lot of strange and unnerving things happened during my time there. And even now, thinking back to those days sends shivers down my spine. It started small, as these things often do. I always felt like I was being watched when I was in my room. It was not a subtle feeling either. It was intense, like someone was standing right behind me. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but then other strange occurrences started happening. If I left the door open to the hallway, I could swear I would see someone walk by out of the corner of my eye. Every single time I would jerk my head up to look, but there was never anyone there. The cats, however, made it worse. We had 2 of them, and they often stayed in my room. Sometimes they would be sleeping peacefully when, all of a sudden, they would bolt upright, staring intently at the door. Their fur would stand on end, and their tails would puff up. No amount of coaxing or petting could calm them down for a long time. This happened so often that I began to dread the moments they reacted that way, knowing I would feel the hairs on my own neck rise in response. It was not just the cats or the feeling of being watched. In my bathroom, there was a shelf where my sister kept her beauty product. One day, out of nowhere, every single item on that shelf came crashing down into the sink. The shelf itself was perfectly secure. There were no loose nails or signs of damage. What baffled me the most was that the items had to bounce out of a 2-inch-high lip to fall. It defied logic. Then there was the night my sister's dresser fell. This was not just any dresser. It was an antique, over 100 years old, and built like a tank. It had been a gift from our grandma and weighed a ton. In the middle of the night, it just tipped over with a loud crash. My sister woke up terrified, swearing she had heard the sound of someone pushing it. When we inspected it later, there was no explanation. No imbalance, no loose footing, just an eerie silence that seemed to settle over the house afterward. The shadowy man was perhaps the most unsettling part of it all. Both my mom and my sister would often yell at me for sneaking around the house late at night. They would claim to see a shadowy figure, about my height, lurking in the hallways, but I was never there. Either I was in my room or not even home. They both swore they had seen it multiple times, and the way they described it always made me uneasy. A tall, dark figure that moved silently through the house. One day we ran into the old owner of the house. My mom, always curious, casually asked if she had ever experienced anything unusual while living there. What happened next left us stunned. The woman started crying, tears streaming down her face as she confessed that she had experienced many strange things in the house, but that no one ever believed her. She looked almost relieved to know she was not alone in her experiences. It was not long after that encounter that I moved out. I could not take the oppressive atmosphere any longer. To this day, I cannot explain what happened in that house. All I know is that I do not miss it. Sometimes late at night, I think about the shadowy figure, the cat, staring at something invisible, and the unexplainable events. And every time I am grateful to be far away from whatever was lurking there.
Story 9. I saw a face.
When I was between 11 and 13 years old, there was a small door in my bedroom that led to attic space. It became a habit to shut the door as I walked into my room a couple of times a week. I never thought much of it, assuming my mom just had not closed it all the way when she last went inside. One day I made the mistake of joking with her when she commented about me not picking up after myself. I said something like, "Every night I have to close the attic door behind you. How about you shut it all the way when you are done?" That is when she told me she had not been in the attic in months. I asked my brother. Nope, he had not been in there. My father, same answer. From that point on, I started paying very close attention. I made sure the door was closed in the morning, checked it after school, after dinner, and then right before heading to bed. Yet somehow, every night, it was open. After a couple of months of wondering and experimenting, I decided to leave it open on purpose to see what would happen. Before school, I opened the door and left it that way. After school, still open. After dinner, still open. Before bed, still open. That night, as I lay in bed, my mind raced as I stared across the room at the open door. Finally, curiosity got the better of me, and I rolled over to focus on the dark space inside the attic. That is when I saw it. A face staring back at me, expressionless, dimly lit, and still. I bolted downstairs, woke my parents, and told them what I had seen. My brother ridiculed me, of course, but my father, taking no chances, went to check for intruders. He even mentioned a recent break-in across the street, where a coin collection had been stolen. Nothing was out of place, and no one was inside the attic. After that, I switched bedrooms with my brother. 6 months later, we moved to a new house because our household was expanding. Years passed, and I mostly shrugged off the incident, chalking it up to an overactive imagination. By my senior year, I discovered how much I loved physics. My new physics teacher quickly became my favorite teacher, and I found myself looking forward to his class every day. At the end of the school year, a friend and I borrowed a VHS camcorder to film silly things around town. On a whim, we decided to visit my old house to see what the new owners had done with the place. The teacher's wife gave us a warm tour of the house, and I shared stories about all the projects my dad had worked on there. When we reached my old bedroom, now a sewing room, I could not resist asking, "Notice anything strange in this room?" Her face immediately went blank. On camera, she asked what I meant. Trying to play it off as a joke, I mentioned the attic door. Her reaction was unnerving. She confirmed that every time she went upstairs to sew, the attic door was open. She then shared an even more unsettling story. On their second day in the house, their German shepherd had gone into that room but refused to come back downstairs. The dog started barking uncontrollably, and then, in a panic, jumped through the window onto the tin roof of the porch, and ran off. It did not return until the next day and has refused to go upstairs ever since. I considered showing my family the video, but in the end I decided to let it be. The attic was not above the house but ran parallel to the second floor, much like a Cape Cod-style home. The door itself was a solid, small door, approximately 2 feet by 4 feet, with a knob that had to be turned to open it. While I still do not know what I saw that night, the look on the wife's face when she shared her story confirmed something strange was happening in that room. Her account added depth to my experience, and mine to hers. Although this did not make me a firm believer in the paranormal, it ensured I could never completely dismiss it either.
Thanks for joining us on this terrifying adventure. If tonight's story gave you chills, let us know in the comments below and share your own scary experiences too. Don't forget to leave a like if you want more nightmares and subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, sleep tight and remember, not all shadows are empty.